All right, we're continuing on with our picky eating series here on the Connected and Capable podcast. I'm Alicia Grogan, and I am so darn excited, truly, that you are here. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for making the time. I just want to encourage you that if you know somebody in your life that is struggling with a kiddo that's a picky eater, whether they're 2 or 12, send this their way. This episode is so important. It has been such an important part of our mission in general with our larger company, yourkidstable.com, that Connected and Capable is part of for the entire time since 2012. Because this is the stuff that nobody really tells parents. And this is a game changer when you understand that your kid isn't eating to be difficult, but they're eating because they're struggling to eat because there's a real challenge. It changes everything. It changes your capacity to show up for them. It gives you a level of compassion and understanding. And that we need that. Oh my gosh, we need that because when you have a kid that's consistently not eating, it is frustrating. It is hard to keep your cool. And believe me, there have been times that I have failed at that. So please don't picture a perfect kitchen here with a mom that has never lost her temper or got upset or said the wrong thing when I'm serving them food. There are times that I'm tired and burnt out and have been really stressed, even though as the OT in me that specializes in this picky eating has known and understood better. But truly, those moments will become so much fewer and far between when you understand what we're getting into today, which are 5 reasons that kids don't eat. Now, I did touch on this in our last episode, which was the first in this series, where I shared more about my son's personal journey with food, going from a super picky eater to a foodie. So if you missed that, definitely go back and watch. But most importantly, the best free resource that I can give you is our free picky eating workshop. It's 3 keys to turn around picky eating. So make sure that you check that out after this episode. It's yourkidstable.com/free. That is also in the show notes. And it is going to go into these next steps of, okay, what do I do? What are the actual things that I can do? Because you can make a change wherever you are right now in your life. These next 3 things in that workshop, you can start doing. Even if you pick just one of them, it's always about just your next step. Okay. All right. So let's get into these 5 reasons. I mentioned this several times in the last episode. The number one reason, and please keep in mind that kids can have several underlying reasons that they're not eating well, is sensory processing. Now, I do want to be clear here because we also talked in the last episode about how picky eating is more of a spectrum. It's also this broad subjective term that a lot of people use. If we are talking about a kid that just doesn't eat their vegetables, yes, there is a sensory component to this. But for today's episode, I'm really framing this around very extreme picky eaters. So that would mean your kiddo, if they have less than 20 foods in their diet, and I know some of you listening, your kid has 1, 2, 3, or 4 foods. They're definitely in this category of, okay, something else is going on here. This isn't just, oh, my kid just wants certain types of food. Your kid is stressed out, melting down, gagging, flipping out when you try to change or present new foods, or they try to taste a new food. One of these underlying reasons is most likely going on. So we're really talking about kids that have more of a hard time, whether they are 2, 3, or 4. As I said, my son, gosh, he was even before 1 years old, and I knew that there were one of these underlying causes majorly in play. And so that, of course, was sensory. So let's talk about what that means. First of all, if you're listening here, Connected and Capable, all of our episodes are around uniquely wired kids, around regulation. And so if you're listening here and my kid is uniquely wired, they are neurodivergent, they have autism, they have ADHD, they have sensory needs in other areas of their life, it is almost certain that sensory processing is at least one factor for why they are so selective about their foods. Now, what I mean by that is that when we eat foods, We have to taste a food, we have to smell a food, we have to touch a food, and we have to look at a food. All of that involves our senses, right? That is literally 4 out of our 5 senses. And you can even argue that you have to hear yourself chewing or eating while you're doing that, because that can even be bothersome to some people. There is actually a diagnosis called misophonia, where some kids are so bothered by the sound of others or their own chewing. Okay, so this is like a full sensory experience every time we eat. You might not think of it that way because your sensory system is likely not noticing, or it's having pleasurable experiences. So your sensory system is wired, your brain is wired in a way that this tastes good, this is pleasurable, or this is neutral. Your brain just isn't sending off any signals saying, whoa, danger, danger, danger. But if you think about it right now, your brain will send off some signals for danger. There is something in your life that you do not like the way it sounds or feels or tastes. Everyone has that, whether it is nails down a chalkboard, whether it is, listening to somebody tap their pen, that kind of just sends shivers up your spine. Whatever that is, your threshold is likely so much higher. Your body sending that signal, or your brain sending that signal to your body, this is horrible. This feels terrible. This is so uncomfortable. Unfortunately, for so many of our uniquely wired kids, as was the case with my son, their brain is sending that signal over something as simple as watermelon or chicken, anything that is different. And so when we see kids gag right as soon as they look at a food, as soon as they taste a food, as soon as they touch a food, this is a huge sign that they have some sensory processing difficulties that are affecting their eating. Now, please hear me, because I do think sometimes people will say to me, oh, well, my kid doesn't have sensory issues in any other area of their life. Sometimes it is really focused just on the eating. Now, often as we start to work together, they do end up realizing, I didn't know that other weird thing that they did was sensory and it is not related to food. That is very possible. But it's also very possible that, and more likely, that you're seeing other signs that your kid has sensory challenges in their life, but as well with their food. And it might not be other sensitivities. So that was the case with my son. Interestingly, he did hate touching some types of messy texture. So that was something we worked on, because I knew that he needed to be able to tolerate getting messy so that he felt comfortable enough to touch foods. If he couldn't touch the food, he wasn't going to be able to taste the food. And so we started with just a lot of play there to help with the sensory component of it. And yes, this is very appropriate for even kids. I will do this even with 10 and 12-year-olds. It just looks a little bit different in how you're presenting it with them. But my child's other sensory signs were kind of the opposite. He was a wild child. He was jumping nonstop, crashing into things, running. And so it was subtle. If I wasn't an OT, I would not have fully realized, oh, he's also having sensory needs in these other areas of his life, especially because it wasn't a sensitivity as like, I can't stand getting messy, or I don't want to get dressed, which are often commonly linked to picky eating, because they all go back to the same sense. That tactile sense, our sense of touch, might be wired to be overly sensitive in your child. So your child's brain is just sending off signals like, that's too intense, that's too much, that feels disgusting. That may happen with food, that may happen with clothes, that may happen with crafts and paint and different things that they're doing. But it's also not unusual to see it compartmentalized into certain like specific areas, like just with food. So that's number one. If you're seeing those signs with your kiddo, not wanting to touch, taste, look at food, or gagging, shuddering, and even sometimes throwing up, huge signs that, hey, sensory processing is one of the factors underneath. The second underlying reason that sometimes kids are very picky eaters is because of their oral motor skills. Yeah, I know that's like therapy's talk, but that is referring to all of the muscles in and around the mouth that are required for eating. So those muscles need to coordinate where the food goes and how it moves around. They need to be strong enough to chew and to swallow. And so if there's any part of that that is kind of tricky or hard, kids may be very selective about the types of food that they're eating. Like they're just not going to eat that piece of meat because it's just too darn hard to chew. Kids with oral motor challenges, you may see eating very soft foods. There are occasions where they will eat harder foods because they can feel them better and move them around easier in their mouth. They're not as slippery and slimy. So sometimes they will go for crunchy foods. Oral motor, you will also see kids maybe drooling a lot, food falls out of their mouth. If it's only oral motor, because sometimes it's sensory and oral motor is underlying causes, but if it's only oral motor, kids at an early age usually aren't very stressed about it. It's just like, I don't really know what to do with this. I'll hold it in my mouth forever because I can't even get it out. Like I can't use my tongue to get it out. I don't have that coordination or strength. Or they may pull their fingers into their mouth and pull food out from a young age. So even if you have a child that's older now and they're still not eating well, but you can look back and say, oh my gosh, yeah, they did that when they were 1, 2, and 3 years old. That's an indicator that there might be some oral motor stuff going on, or that they never really learned how to move the food around well in their mouth. So they start to get really selective about what they're willing to put in there. What's easier to eat? What can I move around well in my mouth? That takes us to the third underlying cause. And this one I have dubbed the snowball effect. Now, this is different than what my child experienced. For those of you that listened to the last episode, I talked about how my son, from just pretty much right out of the gate, as soon as he started eating, there were just huge signs there was sensory stuff going on. For kids that have this underlying snowball effect, and we've had many students in our picky eating program have this as an underlying cause, their kiddos start off at a regular eating pattern. They're eating well as babies. They eat well at their first birthday. And then sometime, usually between the time they're 1 and 2, although sometimes it's a little bit later, they start to get picky. And it starts off slow at first. It's, I don't want that, or there's certain foods that they don't want. And parents, understandably, get kind of freaked out about that. And so they may cater to the child a little bit more, give it a little bit more attention. Oh my gosh, I just need them to eat. If they're going to eat those chicken nuggets, I'm just going to keep making the chicken nuggets and I'll feel better that they eat. And then at some point, there's this sinking feeling that, oh my gosh, they will not eat anything other than these chicken nuggets now. That's the snowball effect. It builds over time. They usually start off as good eaters, and then the picky eating begins at some time in the toddler or early preschooler years. When kids get pushed to a point, like if over time they have narrowed their eating so much, it can be hard for them to come out of that. Typically, we see the average picky eating range go from around 1.5 to 3.5 to 5 years old, meaning that it's in that window of time that most kids get a little bit more selective. And there's a bunch of stuff happening here developmentally. First of all, their taste buds become more enhanced, right? They weren't tasting as much as babies, quite literally. And so their taste buds further develop and they taste them more clearly. Also, toddlers have an intensity for bitter tasting foods. Guess what's bitter? Vegetables. And that is like a evolutionary byproduct because they have this super tasting for bitter because it was a protective mechanism that they would not eat random things in the wild and potentially die and get sick. So toddlers are particularly sensitive to vegetables and the way that they taste super intense to them. So that is why we see so many toddlers and preschoolers pulling away from the intense taste that they're experiencing when they eat a piece of broccoli or cauliflower or zucchini or whatever that is, the vegetable that is in front of them. However, if we stay the course if we follow the 5 steps that we talked about in the last episode, particularly step number 1 in creating that no pressure environment, and step number 2, sticking with our routine and really trying to be intentional about those things. If a child enters that natural picky eating phase, they will come out of it. What's interesting is that depending on which study you read, there are some studies report that as much as 50 to 60% of kids are picky eaters. So again, a lot of this is self-reported, but this shows us that most kids are going through at least some type of average picky eating phase. It is obviously a smaller percentage of kids that are such severe picky eaters that it is causing major distress and turmoil around meals. If your child is in the snowball effect, key things that you will know that they are was that they were a good eater, and then you saw it start slow and it got bigger over time. That brings us to our 4th underlying cause, which is physical. This one is the trickiest, and it will involve getting your doctor on board. And I normally suggest that you should kind of rule out the other 3 that we had just talked about first and consider then if there is truly no other underlying cause to this, is there something physical that may be stopping them from eating? And the challenge here is that you can't always tell. While there are some signs for some challenges like reflux, sometimes kids have silent reflux and it's coming halfway up their throat and going back down without us knowing, but it's creating a lot of discomfort. So your child might be intuitively selective about what they're eating because they kind of have this instinctive sense of what's going to hurt and what's not going to hurt. They're probably not able to articulate that. And if your child is 7 or 8 years old and have always had reflux or have had it significantly at times and then it's gone away, their brain might be really trying to protect them from that. But they are, even at 7 or 8 years old, not probably realizing that this isn't normal because it may be something that they've always experienced. Constipation is another major physical challenge that's very common, and that one you would know about, right? So if your child is experiencing frequent constipation and that they are not regularly having a bowel movement every day, at the most every other day, but again, the goal really is every day, it is very common to see major fluctuations in their eating. So keep in mind that if you have a couple of meals that go really well, and then you have a couple of days that go really bad, this may be linked to that constipation. If there's nowhere for the food to go because a child is constipated, their appetite is going to shut down, right? So it's important to get the constipation managed. There's lots of ways to do that. I will link up our constipation blog post in the show notes because we have a lot of healthy, natural strategies on how to help kids, or at least point you to what to be asking, what questions to look for, what questions to ask with your doctor if your child is struggling with constipation. There are other physical challenges, though, besides reflux and constipation, although those are the most common. It becomes far less common to have other challenges, like sometimes kids have physical abnormalities in their mouth. They may have super enlarged tonsils. I saw a kid that had an odd flap of skin at the top. There was just like an extra fold in his esophagus that made it really hard for him to swallow. Some kids have a diagnosis called EOE, which is a narrowing of the esophagus. And that EOE has some clear signs. And we've had a couple of kiddos in our picky eating program that actually found out after taking our program that they had it. And some of those telltale signs are if your child is dipping their food in liquids and then trying to swallow it, that's a sign, their passage has narrowed so much they're just trying to get it down. Or they may take a bite of food, but they won't take anything else. Again, a sensory kiddo would never do that because it's so disgusting. They couldn't even get a bite down. It's way more telling that there's something physical going on when a child is trying to eat and you see some problems with swallowing, or you see a child wincing. And again, sometimes there are no signs and they have no real way of articulating, even again in elementary age years, what's really going on here. And so in that case, that's definitely worth seeing a pediatrician at a minimum, and if not, and most likely needing to see a pediatric gastroenterologist and really advocating for what you're seeing in your kid when you feel like, oh my gosh, we've looked at every other angle of this and nothing is really making sense. And then our last underlying cause, and this is the one that I get probably the most questions about, is anxiety. Because here's the thing, with all of the underlying causes that we just talked about, sensory, oral motor, that snowball effect, physical symptoms and challenges, when eating is hard, it becomes a negative experience for a lot of kids. And that makes their fight or flight center turn on. That likely is, shooting cortisol into their system and making them feel really anxious around food. So it's very common to see that your child has an anxiety component along with sensory needs, along with trying to chew and swallow, or these underlying physical causes that you might be unaware of. So know that that is often a component of it. And as we address these underlying causes, kids start to feel comfortable eating, and that anxiety naturally goes down over time. Now, if a child is older, some of those anxiety kind of pathways in the brain that have developed as a way of protection, because the brain has been like, you know what, I'm not doing that. It's really uncomfortable. It feels really awful. The brain is trying to protect again and again and again. And by the time a child is a preteen or teen, a lot of those negative thoughts around food are very prevalent. And so if you are noticing, gosh, my kid is just so negative about food, they seem so upset. As preteens and teens, we tend to see that decrease in kind of the meltdowns or tantrums or upsets. And we see more argumentative pushback, shutdown. And that is really a sign that, hey, my anxiety is up and you're not really getting like why this is hard for me. And unfortunately, the brain is growing and developing. It has now been in this protective mode around food for years. And so those anxiety thoughts can become very strong, and they can be very strong loops and circuits in a child's brain that really are becoming a major reason that they're struggling with eating food. And so it's important to consider how big of a role anxiety is playing. Again, for younger kids, you often can go and just focus on the underlying cause. And I would say 10 and under for a lot of kids. Sometimes 8, 9, 10 years old, we have to do some anxiety kind of work around that as well. However, there are times that kids are not eating because anxiety and anxiety alone. These kiddos tend to have anxiety in other areas of their life. They don't have any of these other underlying causes. They may have been like a very good eater for years. And when you saw their general anxiety or OCD get worse, it translated now into their eating as well. Because again, when the brain is pushed to a point where it is in fight or flight, even again, this has nothing to do with food, it's on high alert all of the time. And so it will start to control all aspects. Anxiety will try to control all aspects of the life that your child is leading because it's in protective mode. And so when kids are struggling with solely anxiety, we will see them kind of focus on things like contamination of food. What if this makes me sick? What if this makes me throw up? Even if they don't have a history of that, there is a rumination that is happening that is related more to anxiety, right? So that is something to watch out for. But again, we typically see that in isolation of the other underlying causes. Okay, so now what? I know you might be having to start to think like, gosh, I think that might be one of the reasons, or that might be an underlying cause. What is the next step? Well, even once you've identified these underlying causes, it is so important that we get started with those foundational steps. Remember, that's setting the no pressure environment, that's creating a routine around meals with having regular meal times, trying to have at least one meal a day where you're eating together. That's also working towards having your kid have just a small amount of a new food on their plate or near their plate. So often we're working towards that. For some kids, our goal is just starting with them tolerating food in the room, them tolerating a different food on the table, them tolerating pee on their plate. And I love divided plates for that because picky eaters are often worried about their food touching, and that is different than contamination anxiety. Contamination anxiety is more that this is ruined, it's going to make me ill, it's going to make me sick. There is this kind of irrational fear. There's a very practical fear for many picky eaters that, hey, if you put that pea on my plate and it touches my chicken nugget, it might taste different. And I am not okay with that. So don't you dare put that pea next to my plate, next to my chicken. And so that is a very practical type of fear. And that's why the divided plate come in handy. And yes, I even use these with older kids. There's adult plates, Fiestaware carries adult divided plates, which I love, and we still use with our kids on occasion, just because it's functionally easy depending on what we're eating. So I want you to get started with these first two steps, but it's very important to know and have an awareness that, hey, there might be some more going on here that's underneath the surface. So what can you do practically next? I want you to take the picky eating workshop. If you are looking for more steps, this is the place to go so that you can get our free workshop guide. You can start instilling this no pressure environment, which may take some time. Remember, this is just about the next step. We are going to dive deeper into our third and final episode of this special picky eating series. Of course, we will be addressing picky eating here again, but I really wanted to get foundational episodes in place here. In the next episode, we are going to be talking about a special recipe and why it's so effective for so many picky eaters. It is what I call a gateway food, and I'm excited to walk you through that recipe, how you can make it, and why you should make it soon, besides the fact that it's super delicious and is likely to be something that even your extreme or most super duper picky eater will eat. All right, you guys, if you want to get that workshop, head to yourkidstable.com/free or check it out in the show notes. As always, we love to hear from you. So please let us know if this episode was helpful. Leave a comment if you're on YouTube or Spotify. Leave us a review. We are so excited to hear from you and your ideas. If you want to hear from a new episode coming up, we're always taking suggestions. All right, talk soon.